What's Donald Trump's latest lie about American history? And a taste of what nationalist propaganda is heading your way? Let's check out his George Washington's birthday shout-out. Hey folks, I'm Todd Sturmer. I teach public history at Johns Hopkins. I specialize in the American Revolution, and I'm here to burn the patriot myth to the effing ground. His February 17th statement about Washington's birthday, whoever was ghostwriting for Trump at the time, gave us this. Low on supplies and teetering on the edge of defeat, he carried on, writing victory or death before departing for battle. In the waning hours of Christmas night, Washington's Continental Army ventured through miles of ice-cold darkness with nothing but patriotism in their hearts, courage in their veins, and faith in their God, going on to defeat the enemy and forever change the course of history. Whew. Let's unpack that. But let's start with the victory or death thing. We have exactly one source. Just one. It's not a bad one, but it's one. For Washington supposedly writing those words before the surprise attack on Trenton on December 25th. Benjamin Rush, interesting guy, the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence and a member of the Continental Congress, later wrote that he visited, later in his memoir, written in the 1790s probably, that he visited Washington on December 24th, on Christmas Eve, on the day before the attack, and, quote, passed near an hour with him in private. He, Washington, appeared much depressed and lamented the ragged and dissolving state of his army in affecting terms. I gave him assurance of the disposition of Congress to support him under his present difficulties and distresses. While I was talking to him, I observed him to play with his pen and ink upon several small pieces of paper. One of them, by accident, fell upon the floor near my feet. I was struck with the inscription upon it. It was victory or death. There you go. That's it. Rush, just on the next page, recalls that he later learned that that was the Army's countersign for the attack on Trenton. That's the entire basis of the claim that Washington personally wrote it. A piece of paper landed on the floor. It had victory or death on it. First of all, is Rush credible? So I do a historical methodology here. Well, he's not writing at exactly the same time. He's writing 20 years later. But Rush was the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's writing not that long later, and he's proved to be a reliable narrator in other respects. So maybe, in another sense, he was not Washington's fanboy. Washington hated Rush. Rush hated Washington. There is a great letter that Rush wrote to John Adams in 1812, which is just scathing. It's entirely about why Washington hated Rush and Rush hated Washington. And Rush pleaded with Adams to burn it after reading it, but Adams might have. But the thing is that Rush didn't burn his copy, so it ends up at the Library Company of Philadelphia. So anyway, so it's this scathing critique of Washington, full of all of these personal anecdotes, and all of these anecdotes from people who also knew Washington at the time. And it includes one officer who said, Washington is a weak man. I know him well. And another one is one of Washington's generals. I won't get into all of them, but one of Washington's generals, not named Horatio Gates, by the way, if you know, you know, told Rush that Washington was, quote, fit only to be the head clerk of a London counting house. So, getting back to historical methodology, Rush's credibility, how does he know what he knows, and can we believe him? Was Rush interested in making Washington look better than he was? Probably not. But even if he was telling the truth about that piece of paper, it still doesn't mean Washington authored it, right? Only that he might have jotted down the password that somebody else assigned, or that he just let fall something that somebody else had written. More importantly, it was a military countersign, not what's implied in the Trump statement, a personal manifesto. And the Trenton attack, let's talk about that a little bit. Trump's version. Washington's Continental Army ventured through miles of ice-cold darkness with nothing but patriotism in their hearts, courage in their veins, and faith in their God, going on to defeat the enemy and forever change the course of history. Man, these writers. Nope, not what happened. Washington had to attack because the Continental Army was falling apart. Why? Not enough zeal, not enough patriotic zeal, and it doesn't look like God was all that influential on them either, unless God was telling them, go home, GTFO. They were deserting. Well, not deserting. Their enlistments were expiring, but the army was just disintegrating, which is what Rush says, right? That the army is just falling apart, and there are a lot more enlistments that are about to expire. So Washington still has to do something. He had lost battle after battle. The British had just pushed him around New York and New Jersey. He lost New York City. And if he didn't pull off something dramatic, he'd have no army left to do anything with. So he did the logical thing, right? He ambushed the Hessian garrison at Trenton when he knew that they were going to be drunk from celebrating. It was a surprise attack. And a tactical win, okay. But he did not go straight from that to this string of glorious victories that in the end resulted in a change in human history. Wow. What did he do right after Trenton? He went across the river, went back to Pennsylvania. Then he did, a couple of days later, recross the Delaware, which incidentally doesn't get a painting, right? We don't have Washington recrossing the Delaware. Lloyd's missed an opportunity there. So he recrosses the Delaware, occupies Trenton, and then goes after the British, and they engage at Princeton, which turns out for Washington to be another minor tactical success. And it wins Washington the ability to winter in Morristown, New Jersey, and the British commander, Cornwallis, more later on him, to actually spend the winter in New York City. So maybe that's just a win-win. Because the war drags on for another 4.5 more years in terms of the fighting. Well, 5 years. 1782. Forget about Yorktown. Almost more than 5 years. And then it's another year after that, 1783, when the war actually ends and independence is achieved. So crikey. But this is exactly how the patriot myth and the founder worship thrives. You take a moment, you strip away all context, and then you retrofit it into this nationalist fever dream. Trump isn't honoring Washington, he's using him. Surprise, surprise. He lived on as a legendary titan of American liberty. He was a unifier, a patriarch of freedom. Man, they're not truths, those are slogans. And they're certainly not historical. Washington wasn't a unifier. Well, unless by unifier you mean enslaving over 300 people for his own private gain. He certainly unified them in hating him. And he certainly didn't stand for the rest of the 20% of the population that was enslaved, or the 10% of Americans who were loyalists, or indigenous nations. Don't get us started. He sought to subdue them and use some stronger language. And then there's Trump's, which we got to talk about with this. There's Trump's actual take on Washington. In 2019, he visited Mount Vernon. In a visit that one person who was there said was absolutely bizarre. He didn't know about Washington's life. He didn't care about Washington's life. He mocked the mansion, saying that he could have built it better, cheaper, and with bigger rooms. And he thought Washington was an idiot for not naming Mount Vernon after himself. So when Trump now pretends to revere Washington, it's actually not funny. He's hardly channeling history. He's turbocharging authoritarian nationalism and deploying American history to legitimize it, a fictionalized version of that history to legitimize it. So let's just run through the fact check real quick. Did Washington write Victory or Death? Maybe, probably. So it was a military countersign for troops in action at night. That's it. Was he a visionary unifier with an American first foreign policy? Maybe. I don't want to pretend to know what the hell America first means. I'll leave all that one for Alexis Coe. He certainly was willing to use other countries and twist those relationships to achieve his own ends. Spoiler alert, the Continental Army does not win the war for independence. The French win the war for independence, and the Continental Army comes along for the ride. But the French win the war, and then they get rewarded when Washington chose to sign the U.S.'s first major trade treaty, not with them, but with, the British. The Jay Treaty, it was in all the papers. Was he fighting for universal liberty? Hell no. He fought for political independence so that he and his fellow enslavers could just run their own show. If you think the American Revolution was fought over a grand idea, a noble liberal idea of universal liberty, you're not talking about 18th century reality. It just shows that you're a product of post-World War II American nationalism, something that we will unpack. Washington and his compatriots wanted political independence for their own reasons, which widely differed. And they didn't win it alone. The French won it for them. All that is the hard but much more interesting truth. The Revolutionary War wasn't about ideas. It was about power. Washington brutally exploited enslaved people for his wealth, fought a civil war for independence, then helped build a nation that doubled down on slavery and exclusion, expanding both in perpetuity. That's the history Trump and his people not only won't give you, they now want to keep us from giving it to you, and instead filling your airwaves and classrooms and social media feeds with lies. And he's going to get plenty of help with that. The patriot myth survives because it thrives on simplification. It thrives on starving complexity. If Washington is the perfect hero, if Trenton was a moment of divine destiny, if the war was all about freedom, then we don't have to deal with Washington as an enslaver whose wealth was entirely built on human suffering, and he did nothing about any of that. The Revolutionary War was a civil war that divided families and communities in ways that had nothing to do with differing ideas about liberty and freedom. The fact that loyalists, 10% of the population, were just as committed to liberty and constitutional freedom as the patriots. We don't have to deal with the fact that indigenous nations were not fighting for freedom unless it's the freedom from colonial invasion. And the fact that enslaved people saw more opportunities, including enslaved people who were claimed by George Washington, saw more opportunities for freedom with the British than with Washington. We don't get to pretend that Washington was fighting for us. He was fighting for himself. And we can't change that. It's what actually happened. It's facts over feelings. Which brings us back to that Benjamin Rush letter. It's really a great letter. He once urged Charles Thomson, he tells Adams this, he once urged Charles Thomson, the Secretary of the Continental Congress, the only other name that is on the original publication of the Declaration of Independence with John Hancock is Charles Thomson. And Charles Thomson is Secretary of the Continental Congress for the entire lifespan of the Continental Congress, from 1774 to 1789. Benjamin Rush thought, well, given all that, Thomson would be perfect to write a secret history of the American Revolution. Somebody's got to start writing this stuff down by the 1790s. But Charles Thomson says, no, and tells Rush, I could not tell the truth without giving great offense. We'll tell the truth. We don't mind giving offense. They're all dead anyway. They won't hear us. But if you're looking for a more fitting battle cry than victory or death, maybe try what Washington's troops actually read before the Trenton attack. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. Thomas Paine, The American Crisis, December 1776.